So, hi everybody. I'd love to introduce Brian Enquist from University of Arizona and the Santa Fe Institute, and he'll be talking about just measuring global ecologies and well, understanding how they relate to society. You're welcome, Brian.
Great, thank you so much. I think without further ado, I'll just kind of jump into it. Let you know that I'm a professor here at the University of Arizona and also at the Santa Fe Institute. And so what I would like to present then today, I can figure out my screen, there we go. All right, hopefully that works. So I would like to talk to you today about is our work on kind of integrating biodiversity data with this grand challenge of predicting the future of biodiversity in the planet, as well as the functioning of the biosphere. And this is a pretty tall order, considering the nature of the problems we're facing in the biosphere. But I like to kind of emphasize at the start here is that we just finished the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity, an entire decade focused on global understanding of biodiversity and what needs to be done to effectively not only live in harmony with nature, but also to protect biodiversity on the planet. And I think if you poll most people in the US or in the world in general, they're probably unaware that we just went through this entire decade. And so this is the Convention of Biological Diversity, or the CBD. And the CBD has then been charged with trying to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, but also set various different global targets, in particular minimizing extinction risk. So I'm really concerned about the underlying science and the data associated with addressing the nature of biodiversity on the planet, but also what's going to happen to not only biodiversity, but the functioning of the biosphere itself. And so kind of the grand challenge is, can we actually predict the future of biodiversity and the functioning of the entire biosphere? We hear a lot about our colleagues over in geosciences and the physical sciences having to do with the nature of the atmosphere and our changing atmosphere, and the incredible predictive ability that we now have in terms of understanding changes in our atmosphere. But what about the biosphere, right? So the biosphere is shaped by something known as biodiversity. And I like to kind of emphasize the biodiversity component here because it's a kind of a term that we all kind of know and maybe you've heard occasionally, but we should kind of define it a little bit formally. And so biodiversity is really defined as the variety and variability of life on Earth. So it's not just the number of species, but it's also how they differ from each other in terms of maybe their sizes, their colors, what they do, and the various different attributes in terms of how they influence ecosystems and human
Brian,
well-being and so on. Yep.
I think you're going
Yes.
to slides, but we cannot see them.
Oh, really? Oh my goodness. All right. So hold on.
Oh, I can see them.
I can see the
Oh, you
slides.
can.
I mean, they're not full screen, but I can see them.
It was in the editor, not the
Oh, they're in the
Oh.
editor. All right, hold on. I'm sorry. Let me quickly kind of change that over. That is totally.
Oh, right. You have the window share.
Yeah. Let me try this. Hopefully, this is going to be a little bit better. Okay. Okay. Is that a little bit better?
No, it's still the editor.
Oh, it's still the editor. Oh my goodness. Didn't I just fix this?
Yeah, when you share the whole screen, it would work.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try this. My apologies. All right. Much better. Okay.
Yes.
So biodiversity, right? So it's defined then as the variety and variability of life on Earth. Okay, so not only do we want to understand how many species there are, but we also want to know what they do, where they are, and how they potentially influence not only ecosystems and each other, but also us as human beings, right? All right, so what I would like to do today is try to kind of distill the nature of this problem and make it a little bit more simple. And in particular, I want to focus on two insights from the study of complex systems, and in particular, macroecology. And so I'm interested in understanding if we can develop more of a general theory for understanding the fate of the biosphere and actually try to predict with various different time horizons how we can best conserve biodiversity, but also the functioning of the biosphere itself. So two major areas of focus that I think offer us the best ability to really ascertain the nature of the biosphere and what will happen. The first is something that we call the drivers of global rarity. That is how abundant something is, all right? So in particular, we're talking about species here. But also we want to focus on variation in an attribute then of an organism or a species, and that is its size, its body size, okay? So what I'm going to do as I kind of move forward here is kind of emphasize why rarity is so important, but also why an attribute of an individual or a species, its body size, is tremendously important, okay? Especially if we want to know about the functioning of the biosphere, okay? So why are we focusing on this? Because these two attributes actually disproportionately impact the probability of extinction, as well as ecosystem and biosphere functioning, okay? So two attributes turns out to be critically important. All right, so the biosphere. So what is the biosphere? Well, the biosphere is this intersection between all the living things then on the planet and the interactions between the atmosphere, the hydrosphere or water on the planet, as well as all the rocks and the geology and everything known as the lithosphere. So the biosphere really is this living component then of our planet. Okay, and so biodiversity itself really does define the functioning of the biosphere. So what I'm going to try to do here is emphasize that macroecological complex systems thinking about rarity and size turns out to be tremendously important for understanding the biosphere. Now, I was actually influenced by reading this book that came out by Pierre Bach. This came out in the early 90s. It has this presumptuous title, How Nature Works, The Science of Self-Organized Criticality. And there's a lot of different ideas in this book, but I want to kind of emphasize one thing that Bach pointed out about the nature of complex systems. And that has to do with something that he emphasized as this universal signature of complex systems than themselves. And that is this inverse size frequency distribution that appears to be characteristic of most complex systems then that we can think of. So I'll give you kind of one example here of size and magnitude. So on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a map. Okay, this is an early map of the New Madrid Fault Zone. This is kind of in the area of Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And this is the distribution of earthquakes. And so the larger the dot, the larger the size of an earthquake. And then on the left-hand side, we're plotting this inverse size frequency relationship. That is the relationship between the magnitude of the earthquake and the total number of earthquakes then that have been kind of observed, right? And we get this inverse relationship. Basically, there are many small earthquakes and very few big ones, okay? But at these scales, we start to see these statistical regularities in terms of the distribution of event sizes, right? And so we can look at city size distributions, all right? So this is actually from ZIP's original kind of findings around the year of 1920. This is the distribution of city sizes across the planet. If we go today, we can generate a similar plot with a very similar distribution. That is, effectively, we live in a lot of very small little towns and dwellings, but very few enormous big cities. And so this is Tokyo, by the way, the largest city on the planet. Inverse relationship between size and frequency. All right, so you may be asking me, well, why are you kind of emphasizing these relationships? Well, because they're very general, and biology really is no different. And so if we look across geologic time at the total number of biological extinctions over the last 600 million years ago, and so if we look at the percent then of species going extinct kind of through time all the way up to present day, we see that extinction goes in fits and starts. There are periods of time with relatively low extinction in terms of number of extinction events, but there are occasionally these big, massive extinction events, usually caused by things like asteroids and things hitting the planet. But if we look at the frequency distribution in terms of the number of extinction events, most extinction events are actually very small. The vast majority of extinction events take place in these very small events, but occasionally we get these big, massive events as well. Inverse relationship between size and magnitude. Now, we call these distributions heavy-tailed distributions. And I'm not going to go into a little bit more detail, but you should know that there's a very rich literature here. And so we can start discussing whether or not these distributions are log normal distributions, Pareto distributions, Levy distributions, and so on. There's a rich literature in terms of trying to assess what underlying statistical processes are responsible for these distributions, and including debates, right? And in particular, are these distributions just statistical signals of some sort of attribute of multiplicative systems? Or is there something special about them? That is, do they tell us something about the underlying nature in terms of how these systems are organized and how they will respond then to future change? Now, these inverse relationships, okay, are ultimately the result of multiple interacting processes, usually in a multiplicative systems, okay? Economies, ecosystems, human systems in general. Now, is there a deeper meaning here? Is it deterministic or a random process? Okay, I'm going to skip that debate here. But what I want to try to argue for this talk is that they provide powerful baselines to assess the nature of change, to predict future change, and for scaling up from individuals all the way to system level attributes. Okay, so powerful baselines. So here we are in the Anthropocene, right? And so I'm concerned about developing our science so we can better see then into the future and understand how differing scenarios will influence our rapidly approaching future that we call the Anthropocene. Okay, so remember, I wanted to focus on two major attributes of complex systems. In particular, within biology, I'm going to focus on the first pattern, something that we call a species abundance distribution, or a SAD, species abundance distribution. And we want to try to assess the global species abundance distribution. So something that we call GSAD, the global species abundance distribution. Okay. Now, in stepping back, we wanted to know something very basic. Okay. So I'm more of a botanist, and plants are great and wonderful. They rule the world. And we wanted to know at the start, how many plant species are there on Earth? Simple question, right? Well, you just count up how many species then that we know of. Well, it turns out that that is a little bit more of a difficult task to just sum up how many species that have actually been observed. But then we wanted to go from there and say that actually, well, what fraction of that plant diversity is rare? So remember, I'm interested in rarity because it's going to tell us something important about the future of biodiversity. So we want to know something about rarity, the fraction of plant diversity that's rare. So why are we focusing on rarity? Well, it turns out that biodiversity is largely a story of rarity. The bulk of the diversity in the natural world, and actually the non-natural world, has to do with what the rare species are doing. So biodiversity is largely a story of rarity. But also, rare species, it turns out, if we want to predict extinction, the best predictor of extinction is how rare you are. Okay? So we want to know who the rare species are to begin to say something about probability of extinction. Okay. So the best predictor of extinction is small population size. So I want to tell you just a little bit of a story how traditionally we go about searching for species that are prone to extinction. So here we are in Hawaii. It's actually not me, but this is a very famous conservation biologist rappelling down the cliffs, okay, here within various islands and in Hawaii, searching then for some of these very rare species. And so this botanist, his name is Steve Perlman, he collects then many samples here, in particular seeds, to try then to propagate and maintain these really rare species, one species at a time. A tremendous amount of work, tremendous amount of dedication. But we face a much larger problem. This work is exceptionally important, but we need to rapidly identify all the Earth species at risk at potential extinction, seeing that climate is rapidly changing. So to make kind of haste in terms of trying to identify potential areas of extinction, we want to know where these rare species are so that we can more quickly kind of identify where potential hotspots of extinction may be.
So, question about
Sure.
like the importance of of rare species. So, I get why they're important for themselves, right? You know, if there's few individuals, then odds are they're likely to be extinct. But it
Yes.
sounds like they are a marker of biodiversity and overall ecosystems resilience in some ways. Is that correct?
Yeah, so rarity is important for a number of different reasons. One, they're the best predictor in terms of extinction probability, right? Is your abundance. But also, rarity is important. I'm going to kind of hint at this because, you know, if you think about diversifying your portfolio for, you know, managing.
Oh, Brian, we can't hear you. It's muted.
It's on the mute. I think you clicked mute somehow. You had to like go and click the unmute thing, the microphone on the mute screen. But we still can't hear you now that you're unmuted.
Oh, yes. Are you speaking right now?
Interesting.
Right. It says you're listening. We see your screen. Yeah, that was
Can you hear me
strange.
now?
Yeah, maybe the microphone switched. Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, it must have been my headphones. Really weird. Bluetooth.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So yes, potential insurance into the future. Okay.
So that's the argument of one of them is likely to be good for the new environment.
Potentially, think of it as, again, as in, diversifying your portfolio, for investment, right? And so with climate then changing, rare species are basically our bank for potential traits and life histories of species that may actually thrive, do better, and help maintain ecosystem and biosphere services into the future, right? All right, so
thank you.
Can we actually predict extinction based on then potential macroecological generalities? Okay. And so one hope is that there may be laws associated with rarity, right? Biological laws associated then with rarity. But in order then to kind of delve into this challenge of trying to identify then the laws then of rarity, we have a more basic challenge. And that is when I started getting to these questions, at least a decade ago, we thought that addressing some of these generalities associated with biodiversity would be relatively easy, but we ran into an enormous roadblock. And that is the nature of biodiversity data in general. To make a very, very long story short, global biodiversity data are largely balkanized, use different data standards, are filled with errors, and integration between the various different sources of biological information at the continental and global level in particular are just filled with errors, and integration is difficult. And so what I'm showing you here is the absolute explosion in biodiversity data with spatially unique species observations, right? And then kind of outlining in a graphic sense all of these different data associated with traits, that is how organisms kind of function, their attributes, their geographic distributions, and all of these different data providers or aggregators. And we're just kind of showing in a color scheme here in terms of whether or not they're isolated or integrated and the degrees at which they are kind of linked then to each other. And a long story short, if one wants to utilize global biodiversity data, in fact, all of the global biodiversity data that we know of to rapidly address these questions, it's actually difficult because you're going to run into this data integration problem. And so I'm have been trying to lead up this group known as the Botanical Information and Ecology Network. We call it BN for short, Botanical Information Ecology Network. And what we try to do is integrate three basic measures of biodiversity data on plants across the world. Now, we've actually extended this to animals as well because our data model fit pretty well. And so we integrate museum data from herbarium, right? So these are collections data across the world. Vegetation survey data, these are ecologists going out or foresters or agriculturalists and actually recording who is there and various attributes about them, but other trait data, measurements about individuals and so on. So all of these data together, we call the observation unit. And together they really form the basis of our understanding of biodiversity across the planet. Okay? But what we don't have is a way to integrate kind of all of these different data kind of in general. And so this is a whole nother story and a whole nother talk, but I just want to give you a little bit of a window here because it's incredibly important to address these questions, to search for generalities in biological biodiversity data. And so we've had to come up with a novel pipeline here to standardize taxonomic names, geographic names, distributions, assess geographic validation, various different validation then efforts to really clean up and integrate all these various different data sources so that we can basically utilize these data with confidence in terms of saying something about the biological world, right? In terms of the nature of biodiversity. And so this workflow, we're trying to make this as open as possible. It consists of various different steps. If you're interested in integrating taxonomic data and standardizing taxonomic data, there's something known as the TNRS, the Taxonomic Name Resolution Service. For geographic data, we use and put out something known as the GNRS, the Geographic Name Resolution Service. So all of these various different services, again, clean, standardized data so that we can integrate them in order to kind of then do the biodiversity science. So after many years of being kind of hung up in trying to assess the nature of biodiversity pattern, what we've actually discovered is that if one goes through this exercise of more formally integrating trustworthy data and integrate all of the global biodiversity data, just focusing on these workflows, that alone corresponds to the advance of 23 years of data accumulation just by data integration. That is, if we can integrate all of the world's biodiversity data, that's as if we've gained 23 years of scientific advancement by being able to integrate what we just have right now. And because time is of the essence with biodiversity on the planet, this has really shown kind of new light in terms of how much really that needs to do with just basic data standards, basic data integration, and the need to focus on biodiversity informatics. Right? Okay, so my little spiel there. So at the end of the day, this is what we have. So currently we have trustworthy data, well over 200 million global observations. Okay, really, this is the wheat from the chaff here. And so this consists of many millions of specimen records, plot data, trait observations. And we've gone through and we can now identify the geographic distributions then of about 300,000 plant species on the planet. And this corresponds to, remember our first question, we wanted to know how many plant species are there on Earth. Once we go through and standardize everything, we're talking about on the order of about 350,000 species of plants that we can at least verify as having unique standardized names. Okay, a lot of species. All of this is on open source, available through GitHub and various different APIs in the BN API. So I want to give you just a sample of now what we're able to do once we can kind of standardize and integrate biodiversity data. So we focused on various different groups. Here's a paper that just came out looking at the elevated risk of cactus species under climate change. And so we can map out current biodiversity. So the color ramp here has to do with number of species. So we get these hotspots of diversity of cacti, right? As well as look into the future. And so we do different climate change scenarios, and then we can map out those.
We lost your sound again. Huge.
Yeah, Brian, we can, yeah.
So this is a little strange. I'm not quite sure why my computer keeps going in and out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
All right, that's strange. Okay. And people are interested in this, okay? There is a real need for being able to tell the general public what will happen to biodiversity, right? So in this case, the New York Times picked it up, and a lot of questions that we received was one of actually shock in terms of, wasn't clear actually that things like cactus would be impacted by climate change. But we can do this on a vastly greater scale. And so recently we put out another paper that integrated not only biodiversity, but also what's known with standing stocks of carbon as well as water on the planet. And so we can go through and identify by using various different optimization algorithms, those areas of the planet then that have a high priority in terms of areas of the planet important to save if we care about not only biodiversity, but also things like carbon
and water, important ecosystem services, right? And so this is giving us now a new view of the planet in terms of the functioning then of the biosphere, in terms of biodiversity and also ecosystem services. That is how much carbon these ecosystems are storing and how much water then they're providing then to humanity. So new views and new insights. But we want to know about what's the potential for extinction, okay, as we move into the future. And so we want to know what fraction of the plant diversity is actually rare. And so to do this, we want to let our insights be guided then by theory to tell us, well, what do we expect? What does our theory, our ecological theory, tell us about rarity? And in particular, if you remember, we're interested in the relationship between the number of observations and the proportion of species, right? So we want to know what proportion of species are rare and what proportion of species are common. So we want to know this distribution, this global species abundance distribution. And it turns out we do have some ecological theory. And the first theory actually comes from something known as the neutral theory. So I'm referring to Steve Hubble's book here, Develop Neutral Theory. And so all the derivations kind of point to, if we assume that ecological and evolutionary processes at large scale are effectively neutral, that is, birth, death, speciation, extinction probabilities are effectively neutral, or you can think of it as being kind of constant then, as we move across then species, then we would expect that we should have an inverse relationship between number of observations and then the proportion of species. That is, most species should be rare and very few species should be common. Again, this inverse size frequency relationship. Now, the neutral theory actually makes more stronger predictions. It says that the form of this distribution should be something known as a log series distribution. So statistically, this is great. We can test if these distributions are close to a log series distribution. But it makes another stronger prediction. It says that actually the more linear component then of the slope of this relationship should actually be a slope close to -1 if the underlying processes of birth, death, speciation, extinction are effectively neutral across species. That is, all species have similar probabilities of being born and being killed, all right, extinction. There are a few other models out there. There's something known as the K-niche model. I don't want to go into too much details, but if species differ in their niches, that is, some species like to grow in warmer environments, some species like to grow in colder environments, and there's some differentiation then between species, that is, there's some ecology. It's actually interesting. This model also predicts a log series distribution, but the slope of this relationship should actually no longer be -1, and presumably it's going to be either steeper or shallower based on ecological then differences. So similar distributions. Again, K-niche model, totally different theory, predicting most species then will be rare, very few common. But there's actually another more statistical argument for the distribution then of rarity across the planet. And that's actually coming from the central limit theorem, right? Something that we learn in basic statistics. And that if species then are inhabiting then a system where many processes then are influencing their abundance, and if those processes interact multiplicatively instead of additively, we would actually predict that this distribution shouldn't be a log series distribution, but instead a Poisson log normal, a log normal distribution, okay? A different flavor of a distribution. But also the slope of this relationship should differ from neutrality. All of these different theories predict that most species will be rare, very few common, right? But the flavor of the distribution then will differ. So what do the data look like? So we're using all of our clean processed data from across the globe, and this is the global species abundance distribution. And I'm parsing out the global species abundance distribution for plants 3 different ways. So in kind of the bluish color here, we have specimen records. That is, all these records from museums, global herbaria, and across the world. And the green distribution here, we're actually looking at distribution records from species occurring in plots or surveys. And so what's really important and about surveying the natural world in a plot, okay, where you take a transect or you have a given area and you count all the individuals then within your plot or in your transect, is that it forces you to count everybody, the methodology, right? So we're not just randomly sampling the world. In this methodology, we have to sample all the individuals within a given area, and we take all of these plots, these tens of thousands of plots and surveys, and we combine them all together, and this is the distribution that we get. Again, within there, we're forced to count every single individual that occurs. Now, what's very interesting is that actually statistically, we can't tell all of these different distributions apart from each other. And all of these different ways of parsing the data all show that the vast majority of species on the planet are rare. Very few are common, inconsistent with all of our various different theories. Now, what's actually very interesting is that if we compete these different theoretical predictions, it turns out that these distributions are indistinguishable from the log normal distribution, a Poisson log normal distribution, and they differ from the log series distribution, indicating that this is basically consistent with the central limit theorem. That is, as we sample more and more, we're going to expect a log normal distribution. Now, the slope of these relationships, the linear component then of these distributions, actually differs from the neutral model. They're actually much steeper. The slopes are on the order of about -1.4, indicating that there are proportionately more rare species on the planet than you'd expect then by chance. And if we look at the number of species that have been observed 5 times or less, it turns out that 36.5% of all plant species on the planet only have 5 observations or less. This is something that actually shocked us tremendously. And we delved into these species, and indeed, these are truly rare species that have been observed 5 times or less. Again, I just want to emphasize the majority of species on the planet are observed very few numbers of time, and a shockingly high percentage of those species, about 36.5%, have only been observed 5 times or less in our global databases. So what's maintaining all of these high numbers of rare species? Well, it turns out we can map out where these rare species are. And so this is a heat map then showing the distribution of these rare species. And we can identify these hotspots of rarity. And another long story, but we can ask, what is driving these rare species? Why do they tend to occur in these very small numbers of hotspots across the planet? Well, it turns out these are very special parts of the planet. These are parts of the planet that tend to have been climatically stable through time. That is, we find rare species in areas of the planet that have had the most stable climates in the past. And so this is totally consistent with the idea.
Oh, lost your sound again. Brian, we can't hear you. Oh,
Yeah, Greg, I can hear you, but Brian, I think you're
Yeah.
off. Yeah.
Brian, you're now muted. We can, yeah.
It's weird. It's as if my
Yeah.
my mute button keeps going on and off. Thank you for letting me know. So when we ask in the future, what will happen to these areas? These stable climate areas are all going to shift from being relatively stable to being highly unstable. In fact, when we ask where then are the most unstable climates in each of these cells where we have a high proportion of rarity, we can plot then the probability of the greatest rates of change in climate in each of these cells then with a high number of rare species. And we can now identify those extinction hotspots based then on the rate at which climate is departing from the current climate in which those rare species then exist. So the bad news here is that rare species, these hotspots of biodiversity, tend to be disproportionately in areas are going to be of climate that will become more unstable relative to the climates of the past. Okay, so to conclude, remember, I wanted to emphasize this one important pattern. This is a very exciting time for biodiversity informatics because we are now able to identify many different patterns associated with biodiversity that we haven't been able to do so in the past. For example, assess the global nature of rarity. Okay. And what we do when we find that is that we find the shocking realization that a large fraction of biodiversity, and this is for plants, now we've done this in other animal groups too, and we get a very similar finding, that 36% of land plants are actually very rare. That is observed 5 times or less. And these rare species are special because they tend to occur in these areas, tropical mountains in particular, that have had very stable climates. But climate change, and also I didn't show this, if you look at areas of human impact, that tends to be disproportionately in these rarity hotspots. Okay. Now, I told you in my talk, I wanted to focus on one other distribution. And together, these two distributions enable us to say a lot about the nature of biodiversity and then the nature of the biosphere in the future. The other distribution is called body size distribution. And so we have a lot of different theories associated with the distribution of body size. Okay, and I'm not going to focus so much then on that, but I want to show you just a quick example here. So an inverse relationship, size and magnitude. But here, this is size class, and then the probability of encountering an organism of a given size. Inverse relationship. The red is actually a mammal community, mammals, okay, in one location on the planet. And then the blue distribution is the distribution of plants in a given location. Doesn't matter where you are on the planet. If you go to any location, you get kind of similar distributions. Inverse relationship between size and number of individuals. Basically, there are a lot of small things in the world and very few big ones, okay? So if you just go randomly sample the natural world, most likely you're going to run into something really small. But if you wait or search a little bit longer, you'll run into something a little bit bigger, and so on. Inverse relationship between size and abundance, body size. And so people kind of ask me sometimes, like, what's the most prevalent signal of future change in the biosphere, right? And so they're kind of surprised when I point out that it's downsizing is the most prominent impact that we've had on the planet. And it turns out if we look at the natural world, we can follow the presence of humanity and the increase in human populations by their impact on the largest individuals in the size distribution. Human activities across the globe has disproportionately hunted and exploited the largest animals and plants. And this is a general rule across the board. And so if we look at the mean body size of mammals on continents in general, across all the different continents, the mean body size over the last 100,000 years has decreased, actually quite dramatically. Not so much in the ocean, okay, but we're working really quickly now to also change that. And you don't have to believe these initial numbers. If you go to the Living Planet report, and this is initial one put out in 2016, between 1970 and 2010, populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish across the globe have dropped 52%. But it's not just the populations are decreasing across the board. It's the nature of those populations. In particular, disproportionately, it's the largest mammal, largest bird, largest reptile, largest amphibian, and the largest fish have decreased disproportionately. And it's not just animals, it's trees. So there are these great recent studies here that have estimated that over 15 billion trees are cut down each year. And since the rise of human civilization, the total number of trees on the planet have actually fallen 46%. A similar impact, right? Approximately 50% then loss in the total number of trees on the planet. But if you look at these data, it's actually the largest and the oldest trees that are disproportionately becoming more rare and threatened. So, inverse relationship between body size and number of individuals. Anywhere you go on the planet, you're going to see a similar distribution of plants, animals, okay, be it mammals or insects or so on. So what humanity does is what we call downsize. So the reduction in body size of what we call the megabiota. And so over time, we see this whittling down, right? So this is a general signature of the impact then of humanity on a functional attribute of the biosphere, that is the distribution of sizes of individuals. And so we call these big things, all right, in these different ecosystems across the world, we call them the megabiota, right? So the megabiota are the largest plants and animals then on the planet, okay? And depending if you're in a desert or a tropical forest, okay, the sizes kind of differ, okay? But every ecosystem has its own megabiota. And so if you're interested in this, we've published then some simulations and some theory assessing and kind of arguing that it's actually the megabiota are disproportionately important to the functioning of ecosystems and the functioning of the biosphere. So we can save a lot of time if we focus on the biggest things in an ecosystem. And so we can make these easy analogies, right? So we know that the largest cities and corporations disproportionately impact the global economy, right? Similarly, it's the biggest plants and animals in any ecosystem are disproportionately important for organizing the natural economy, right? And so if we take out these big things out of the ecosystem, that disproportionately ramifies to influence numerous other interactions and the overall functioning then of the ecosystem itself, right? So how do the largest plants and animals actually influence then the functioning of ecosystems then and the biosphere? Well, are they too big to fail, right? And so the Great Recession, 2009, okay, was largely due to the collapse of some of the largest banks in the US, right? So the same thing, like our largest cities, the megabiota disproportionately dominate the flow of resources in the ecosystem. They dominate and store then carbon and nutrients. They're central nodes and networks of interactions. And they're also priorities then for conservation. Right? So the economy, wealth and capital, the exchange of ideas, monitoring of health, these are analogies that are actually very powerful because we can apply them then to the natural economy then of the natural world. So the megabiota, it turns out, disproportionately impact the biosphere in terms of biomass, productivity, and even the fertility then of the planet. And so I want to try to kind of emphasize a little bit more that we can use kind of these general rules or laws in terms of how organisms work to really go in and show how downsizing and future downsizing is going to impact the functioning of the entire biosphere. So if you plot the body size of any organism, including us, in fact, I think humans are
Oh, lost you again. The audio, I mean.
all right, hopefully that'll work. My random.
Again. Sorry. No, we've lost you.
Not sure why my mute randomly goes in and out. Keep telling me if I suddenly become quiet.
You sure?
Okay. So why is their loss important? They store, they move carbon and nutrients and disproportionately impact the fertility of the planet. Okay. So they provide disproportionate beneficial impacts on biodiversity as well as human well-being. Right? And in the paper, we go into more detail about this. And so there's a pretty rich literature. But I wanted to emphasize here how we can assess downsizing on the impact then on the biosphere. And so we really do need to not only develop theory for this, but we need to simulate the entire biosphere in terms of what we know about what we call allometric equations, that is the role of body size in impacting then the functioning of ecosystems in the biosphere. And I want to give you just a little bit of math to give you kind of an indication then of the flavor of how this works. And so the idea is that we want to know how the reduction of the largest size animal and plants influences things like the flux of energy and resources. Now, the nature of the equations then that we use are kind of similar to this. And so what we want to do is we want to say something about the ecosystem metabolism. What influences the ecosystem metabolism? Well, it turns out the ecosystem metabolism is due to two different functions. The metabolism ecosystem is influenced by the distribution of all individuals then within the ecosystem and their sizes, but in particular how resource use and metabolism depends on their size, their body size. So how metabolism changes with body size. But then we also need to know the distribution, the frequency distribution of their sizes. And so if we integrate then across then these two different distributions, that actually tells you that as body size increases, the difference between the smallest and the largest individuals, it turns out that you can best approximate the total ecosystem metabolism by knowing the size of the largest individual. That is, increasingly, the size of the largest individual actually dominates things like the total system production, the total system metabolism itself. So
question, that's
yes.
not, why would that be? Or I guess, what's the relationship between size and metabolism?
Because it has to do with the nature of the relationship between size and metabolism. Big things are much more powerful than small things. Even though there are more small things, it turns out that the nature then of those distributions then combine, so it's the size of the largest individual actually that tends to dominate the total flux then within the system.
So are you driving this off of the power laws you were just showing for the body size?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And so we're utilizing them so we can plug in empirical relationships into this to make these predictions much more specific.
Okay.
Or what we can do is actually simulate it. And so there's this, we've been working with something known as the Mattingly model. This was actually put out by the Microsoft group, actually out of the UK. And it's now, for the most part, open source. There's an R package here for it. But the Mattingly model is another type of global simulation model, but it simulates then biodiversity, but it focuses on body size and the distribution of body sizes then at different pixels across the planet. And so what we're interested in is actually simulating globally 3 different worlds, what we call the Pleistocene world, the modern world, and the future world. The Pleistocene world consisted of the world where we had mammals in particular that ranged up to 10,000 kilograms. Today, maximum sizes on average are around, well, maybe about 1,000 kilograms. But in the future, if downsizing continues, we're looking at a world where maybe the maximum size on average would be about 100 kilograms. So how can we simulate this? Well, the Mattingly model takes then each pixel and it has a basic little trophic web here. We have basic interactions, right? But then we can put in to those basic interactions rules about how body mass influences reproduction, metabolism, dispersal, mortality, and whatnot. And then we can kind of simulate these worlds where maybe we have different body size distributions. And to kind of make a long story short, we can then simulate within Mattingly a Pleistocene world, a modern world, and future world. And we just want to know how then impacting body size distributions, right, will impact the future functioning then of the biosphere. And so we can just look at 3 measures of the functioning of the entire biosphere. That is the global heterotrophic biomass, the global heterotrophic metabolism. This is, again, the metabolism then of the living world, the heterotrophs in this case. But also how then these heterotrophs then diffuse nutrients across the planet. All right, so we're interested, remember, organisms move from cell to cell, they kind of grow and die and they disperse and so on. And so with that, then nutrients, they're ingesting all these nutrients and so they kind of disperse across the planet. So we can measure the nutrient diffusivity in these simulations. And in all cases, if we go from the Pleistocene then to the future world, what we actually find are some very striking reductions in the global metabolism and functioning of the biosphere. In particular, if we just look at the heterotrophs, we're looking at, in the future, a 44% reduction in biomass, almost 18% reduction in the metabolism of the biosphere in terms of the heterotrophic metabolism of the biosphere, and approximately 90% reduction in the diffusivity of nutrients then across the planet. These are large numbers, right? And again, these are based on relatively simple rules, okay, that we can put in, but it enables us to begin to foresee and forecast into the future how, with changing these baselines in terms of these inverse relationship between size and abundance, how then that will impact the functioning of the biosphere. Okay, so
Can
a
you
little bit,
describe
sure.
kind of the details that are accounted for this by this model? It sounds like it's more of a differential equation. It talks about the frequency of different species. It's that precision level. Is that right?
That's correct.
So it sounds like it's not a spatial model, right?
It is a spatial model.
Okay.
Actually, it is a spatial model. You can then, so actually, if you go into the paper, we can then, plot out maps, of this, and we can look at how the reduction of heterotrophic biomass is then going to be distributed across the planet in different biomes and so on. And there's a lot of spatial variability. So I'm just reporting kind of the global then averages of this. But there's this, because these are temporal simulations, you can do this, gazillions of times, of course, and do this multiple times. So you can look at, the trajectories then of these changes then through time. So we're trying to summarize this here and look at the kind of your absolute changes, between kind of the simulated Pleistocene world and the future worlds, and as well as the modern world.
So do you account for like adaptations or how individuals can survive different climates, or is that outside the scope of this model?
That's immediately outside the scope of this model. But what I can say is that the time scale then of these changes, okay, going into the future world, are so much more rapid than the time scales of evolution. That if evolution will occur within these different frameworks, but it's on a much smaller magnitude. And we are actually beginning to assess the magnitude of physiological, acclimation and local adaptation, and just how much we can expect to see from these biological positive feedbacks in response to the environment. And in general, they're really small compared to the overall driver of climate change and human land use change on the timescales that we're looking at, right? It's a good question, and we're still trying to figure it out, but it looks like the adaptation is going to be a very minor component in terms of biological response.
And then one more, you showed us the distribution in species counts, the body size, but what about number of individuals within the species?
Yes, we haven't parsed that out yet, but we're very much interested in doing that too. It's the intersection of these different distributions. Yeah, that's next on the docket. Good question. Okay, so I'm just going to close out here. So I focused on two size frequency distributions, something known as GSADs, these global species abundance distributions, but also body size distributions. These are generalities, no matter if you're in the desert or a rainforest or even in highly disturbed environments, you're going to see distributions like this. And these are general signatures that we can use to begin to simplify our problems, right? And they're baselines for understanding change and organization in natural and in disturbed systems, human modified systems. So these inverse relationships are powerful bases then to scale up and predict, right? And so we can utilize them to then develop more analytical theory as well as simulations. But I've also kind of showed you kind of along the way, in order then to really get at the nature of these distributions, we've really run kind of head into this big data problem. But when people think of biodiversity informatics, they usually think of biological informatics and genomics, right? And there the data are really clean. Once we start dealing with biodiversity data are not only exceptionally dirty, but they're prone with various different errors and all of these different issues associated with integration. And so it's really exciting right now because we're beginning to kind of surpass some of these different hurdles, but there's still much more that we can do. And so now we really can map and discover and forecast attributes of the biosphere in ways that we haven't been able to do just a few years ago. So very exciting time, okay? And so we're trying to understand this nature of biodiversity, in particular abundance and rarity, probability of extinction, but also in terms of their body sizes. So between rarity, abundance, body size, that enables us to say actually quite a bit, especially if we have their geographic distributions, and we're able then to match that then with climate data and land use data. We now have these really unique windows to be able to say with increasing certainty how different climate change scenarios, human land use scenarios will really impact biodiversity and the functioning then of the biosphere. So with that, there are a lot of people to thank on these various different efforts, but in particular, this work would not have been even possible if it wasn't for many different organizations that have not only helped support this work, but also have increasingly made their data available then to the public. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Apologies
thank
for
you
the
very
technical
much.
issue.
Yeah. Are there any questions on the call?
I guess I've got a question. Thank you for the talk, and yeah, apologies for the experience with the sound. It's probably not fun as a speaker to go through that. In the first half of your talk, I guess you were looking at, you know, rare species, and I think you at some point you said something like having lots of rare species is, you know, it's like making bank or something. It's like having diversity in your portfolio, something like that.
Yeah.
But they're all in a few places, so it's like we've got lots of eggs, but they're in one basket or one or two baskets in these hotspots. So it seems like a good thing / bad thing, or maybe that's just the way it ended up. But like, have these hotspots, because they haven't been affected by climate change, have they gone on to seed other regions with biodiversity after they've come out of periods of climate change themselves, or like is that where the future of the world is going to come from, or do those plants not have any scope to evolve to, you know?
Well, yeah, really good question. We really don't know that much about, you know, the deeper time kind of history,
Yeah,
you know, of these hotspots, and we're just starting to get some glimpses. And I mean, it's only been the last few years we've been able then to, you know, match up, you know, past rates, you know, of climate change historically on the planet, and where currently, you know, we see, you know, biodiversity and the nature of the biodiversity in terms of the rarity. But we really don't. If you go back, you know, further in time, we don't really know. You know,
yeah.
It's hard to assess. You know, we need some, you know, deep thinking on that, and probably better integration of various different data sources, in particular paleo data as well.
Yeah, got it. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Following David's question, so how likely or how bad it could be if we introduce this kind of rare species into a different environment, it actually becomes invasive species. So you can see that this certainly, they are confined there, so they don't have the capability of spread. But if we do give him the chance of spread, then it may cause another disaster.
Well, I mean, climate change is going to be doing that anyways. You know, we're now rapidly, you know, you're shifting the climate, so species are on the move. Doesn't matter where you are on the planet, you now can see things that, you know, if you were living in a given, you know, area for all of your life, you're now seeing, you know, species then that deal better with, you know, increased drought, you know, increased temperatures, you know, and so on. In fact, one of the biggest tools that we have for making sure that to minimize extinction risk, it's called assistant migration. That is, we're actually, you know, people responsible for moving then species into climates then that are more suitable than for them. Yeah, and we used to think of them as invasive species, but increasingly, you know, that's going to be increasingly part of our conservation portfolio, actually physically moving species into new parts of the planet, into more favorable climates. Yeah, yeah. It's a brave new world. Yeah. So, anyways, we do have a lot of, you know, big data needs, computation needs, and as well as analytical needs. And so I know you guys are all associated with Google, but you know, we're really interested in trying to do our best to do everything in you know, following open science, but then also we are also limited in our capabilities in terms of what we can do. You know, many of us are based in, you know, public universities, and, you know, still are, you know, access to high speed, you know, computation, performance computing in general is still, you know, we have to wait in line, you know, with a lot of other needs. And we have, you know, a lot of data integration needs that are not, you know, sexy to national granting, funding agencies, but are actually tremendously important. And so being able to convince people that, data integration is actually, important, is fairly critical.
That's very fair. I mean, talks like these are our way of convincing the rest of Google that more investments like this are important.
Mhm.
So let me ask you one thing that can motivate such investments, which is what's the potential impact on agriculture, food production, that kind of stuff? Because that's a rather common emerging story for Google doing something.
Yeah. So actually, there's several kind of intersections, there, and actually we could spend quite a bit of time talking about that. So one kind of important pressing question when it comes then to agriculture is, given future climates, so if you think about future climates like for corn or cotton or, any sort of agricultural crop then that's kind of vital then for humanity. So breeders then are important and understand, well, what they want then to do is try to understand if then the genome then of a species has the propensity to do better in maybe a hotter, drier world, right? So you can actually select and then breed, right, for on different crop species, the potential, to do better into future climates. Now, it turns out that with these biodiversity data sets, what we can do is that we can look at very close relatives of various different crop species, okay? And so close relatives then kind of think of it as your family, right? They're genetically related, right? And often, especially with plants, you can crossbreed them, okay? Either through hybridization or other means, right? And oftentimes those hybridization events, if you crossbreed, with other species or varieties in particular, you can then introduce then novel genes, right? So now what we can do is that we can look at close relatives of crop plants to see where they grow. And then we have, increasingly higher resolution than climatic data. We can then find then the relatives then that are growing, most likely growing in climates most similar, to the future. Maybe variability in precipitation, like highly seasonal environments or something like that.
Right.
So we can now more quickly target, close relatives, okay, based on where they grow and the climates then that they occur in. Okay, so we can identify very rapidly, potential kind of opportunities then for crop breeding then as well. But then increasingly what we can do is, because if we then match this with phylogenetic relatedness, that is the degree of relatedness then of individuals, we can then assess in different types, of crop plants, their genomic kind of background in terms of their ability then to deal with climatic variability then in general, right? So if you're just a crop breeder kind of focused on different varieties, you need to know that geographic information, okay, as well as the larger picture of biodiversity. This is what biodiversity brings then to the table, right? Is that you're able to identify things then that are closely related, but also not closely related at all, right? And so maybe you can do you can then do a much better job than in targeting potential varieties and then potential other species, where if you then introduce then those genes, you can then more quickly then do natural selection, artificial selection, I should say, then for these future climates, right?
So that story is becoming rather common. I mean, the breeding story, and where you would need to have a model that says that if I put this gene into this plant and it's going to go in this environment, what's going to happen? And there's plenty of models that do molecular stuff, models that do some gene environment interaction, some models that parameterize plants, like crop plants, with some photosynthetic efficiency, and then say plant go. Like I have a model of corn, but I have no idea which genes affect photosynthetic efficiency.
Right.
And this emerging work is trying to combine all of them together. So this seems like once those models exist, this would be a great driver, and also and also data set. If you have data sets on related species, that's a much richer model than data sets to crop species, because they're homogeneous.
Right. But also, combining it then with other, trait information, right? That tells you something about, productivity. So these various different traits then that scientists measure then about plants, tell you something about how well then those individuals do in different climates and the specific adaptations then are required to grow then in different environments, right? So I didn't even mention, combining this with, genomic data and samples, right? So the ability to very quickly kind of link genomic data and with geographic distributions, right? And then, the local kind of climate, but also climate variability. So we're having, increasing a higher and higher resolution than data. We can now do all these, this linking of integrating, these various different data sets. But at the center of this, you want to know about the nature of the geographic distribution of biodiversity in general, because you want to make that connection between the geography and the individual and how that individual then does in that environment, right?
Right. If you have this in a biobank, you can say this is the species that I want to study. Then you grow that species, you genotype
Right.
that species, or I guess transcriptome or whatever you need, and then you can say I have a wider data set of genome environment interactions.
Yep.
That is still related to the croplands.
Yeah, exactly. But then also what we can do now, and I didn't go into too much detail, but you can take then past climates and future climates to say something about the nature of how the climatic envelopes then of these species with potential dispersal scenarios and ecological interactions, how then you would expect then these distributions over space then to change and as well, right? So that one then can...
for the future, that kind of thing.
What's that?
Like simulate the future in a growth chamber and see how the
well, you can simulate then the future, okay, both geographically and also, within the growth chamber then as well. Yeah.
I'm also taking notes. These actually sound like really useful and commercial. There's an obvious commercial application, so it's easier for companies to get engaged in these things. And definitely like Microsoft has an agriculture arm, and Google is exploring that direction. So these might actually be ways for Google to participate in a cleanly profit-seeking way, which is easier to motivate.
Yeah. Well, what about just biodiversity itself, and conservation?
Yes.
I know it's hard to
it's
immediately make the link to an immediate human, kind of attribute in terms of, say, like crops, right? I mean, big ag is very powerful, and there's a lot of money, there. What about, within Google, just also, making the pitch for, biodiversity and biodiversity's sake, and then also, the challenge then of preserving biodiversity.
Yeah, no, it's a good story. So it's a matter of figuring out who cares, who's the organization, what the support is. But yeah, that's exactly it. And we're trying to drum up that support. Actually, let me stop recording. Let's see.